When I moved here from Australia, my parents were kind enough to accompany me, help me settle in, unpack my things. So I'm going to paint you a little word picture. I'm in Trinity halls, moving in, unpacking clothes, books, and the other various things that I brought with me. Among those things was a delightful package put together by the Trinity Hall JCR. My mum's going through it. It's got ramen and pens and paper in it, and she pulls out what I like to call the all-star of contraception. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's not dating an engineering student. It was, in fact, a condom. And she sort of giggles and goes, "Oh, could they included these?" And my dad and I just went, no. Because we don't talk about this stuff in my family. We talk about Brexit and real estate, and we suppress our emotions, and it's fine, and I'm actually doing really well. Anyway, so she says, "What? Like, you've got to use them," trying to justify the incredibly uncomfortable situation she's put us all in. And we just kind of move on in the conversation. But thinking back on it, I think my mum had more in mind for her darling youngest daughter than just the avoidance of syphilis. She obviously knew I needed to avoid getting pregnant at all costs, but not just because of the social stigma that would be afforded to me by my private school peers in Brisbane, Australia, but because she knows the future my potential children would live in is absolutely dire. She knows what everyone downside opposition tonight knows, which is that in the year 2119, which by the way is already a fucking mouthful to say and bad enough for that reason itself, our world will not be a better place. It will be at least as bad as it is now, but more likely we think it will be worse. The main reason I bring to you for that tonight relates specifically to technology. But before I get into that, some rebuttal. So what it seems has been the main issue in tonight's debate, we think perhaps a little bit wrongly, has been climate change. So what's the characterisation we hear from side proposition? We hear it isn't totally reversible yet. Companies are doing their bit. Seemingly unlikely things are happening as seemingly unlikely things have happened in the past. We've already told you at first why climate change is a fundamentally different threat to any we've faced in the past, because as opposed to just growing crops on an earth that already exists, the earth will literally not exist. That is a fundamental difference. It is an existential threat that was not weighed up sufficiently on side proposition. So what else do we hear? We hear that we have time to solve for it. We have innovation that will solve for it. We thought what this conceded was the fact that we are very much just mitigating a threat that we already know is going to get worse. And we hear this when proposition tells us that people's houses are going to be on fire, and that's going to generate enough political will to make politicians finally solve the problem. We thought the fact that people's houses weren't on fire at all was a bit of an indication that things weren't necessarily as good as they used to be. The only time house should be on fire is up in the club. And so what else do we hear? We hear that eventually the political incentive will just kind of exist, right? Well, we thought this lied on the assumption the political system that's currently dominated by big money and fossil fuel companies was suddenly, for some reason, just going to stop operating the way it does. That for some reason, politicians were going to stop getting payoffs. We didn't hear enough analysis as to why that would actually be the case. In fact, I think what was supported was just kind of the status quo in that situation. So we didn't think that that political incentive existed at all. We also got very little response on the material about the rock, which we think is a genuine worldwide tragedy. Yeah. All right, so on to my main point as to why technology will have screwed us over fully by 2119. So let's talk about artificial intelligence. So it's widely considered that AI will develop consciousness, certainly within the next century. Firstly, we know it's scientifically possible. Secondly, historically, innovation has been looked on really positively and as a great sign of growth, as we already heard in this debate. Therefore, we don't think it's something that's typically going to be particularly likely to be regulated, because people just think innovation, great, let's let it happen. Why not? In the same way that, and we think this works in the same way that when you raise taxes, people say, "Get your hands off my money." We don't like that regulation of that kind. We think innovation being regulated in this kind of way, limiting the harms of AI, will be "Get your hands off my pursuit of the human spirit." So the best description I can give of this, right, and this is sort of the only way my tiny brain can conceptualize it, is do you remember Clippy from Windows in the early 2000s, who would, based on the context of what you're doing, sort of give you instructions and guidance? He was my best friend. Well, okay, the best way I can describe AI would be if Clippy developed consciousness and then also the coke addiction of a Wall Street financier, i.e. never sleeps, goes to work buzzed, screws over regular people, and causes social and economic collapse. So, how? Well, we think that developing this super intense smart consciousness is bad because when things are conscious and smarter than us, they're going to want rights. Don't get me wrong, I'm super into rights. But let's look at the two ways that that is then likely to go. So first, the first path is that they don't get the rights because humans have historically not been super into granting rights to people who don't find water spicy. We think then they're going to do what people do when they don't have rights. They're going to stage some kind of AI uprising. We don't actually think this is necessarily out of the scope of this debate. And though the eventual robot uprising biopic will be an incredible 627th installment to the Fast and Furious franchise, it will not be great for humans because we will not be able to match the strength of these literal killing machines. So what's the other way this can go? So we do give them the rights. We think that that makes it difficult to govern. And like, if literally nothing else, it's just kind of weird. Like, imagine going to a polling booth and seeing this like weird-ass computer, like filling out its like little vote card.
Point.
Sure thing.
Okay, so if people think robots are weird, doesn't the government, and are gonna like take their jobs, doesn't the government have an incentive to regulate those robots?
Sure, the government does, but when you're actually framing it, as it's been already framed in this debate, as like innovation and like the constant pursuit of excellence and getting better, then like we think that there's a very little incentive to do that. We think that we've already seen that with like the amount of automation that's already happened, like hasn't been regulated to nearly the extent it probably should have been. So why is this so bad? Apart from the Fast and Furious movie I mentioned earlier, this is really bad because in its most harmful form, it poses an existential threat. And it's a threat that exists regardless of whether climate change gets us, and it's a threat that exists regardless of whether this fun authoritarianism thing that people seem to be trying out again gets us either. In its least harmful form, this just makes things more difficult because of economic disruption and we think potentially strained human-AI relations. The day that I moved into halls, my mum was warning me against the treachery of the next 100 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Kesha once said, "This place about to blow." Well, panel, by 2119, it will have. Thank you.